You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 7th of March 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
we are determined to invest more, to invest better, and to invest faster together. From Paris to London to Brussels, we have shown that we are willing and able to step up our joint efforts and to coordinate effectively.
If the West splits, what does Europe do? EU leaders gathered in Brussels yesterday, but can they move fast enough to come up with a defence strategy for a new world order? Also ahead on today's show, Seoul wants one of its judges to join the International Court of Justice. We'll ask what the addition of a South Korean voice will bring to the world's court. Plus,
the art experience is very focused, is very frontal, but then somehow the social experience also connects with the way we are in this city.
We'll be at Arco Madrid to find out what the city's contemporary art fair brings to the Spanish capital. And we'll head to Milan for a preview of the Triennale, and we look through the papers too. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. US and Ukrainian delegations will meet in Saudi Arabia next week to discuss what Washington calls an initial ceasefire with Russia. Donald Trump has suspended tariffs on both Canada and Mexico for a month. The 25% tariffs, which came into force on Tuesday, will now be delayed until April the 2nd. And the Vatican has released an audio message from the Pope, who's being treated in hospital for pneumonia. The short recording was played out across St. Peter's Square yesterday evening. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Europe needs a plan. Faced with the possibility of the US no longer being by its side, the continent is rapidly trying to work out how to fend for itself. Well, yesterday, EU leaders met in Brussels to try to formulate a strategy to bolster its own defences and also to offer continued support for Ukraine. So they promised to increase defence spending, and then they renewed their commitment to supporting Ukraine. In a unanimous statement, they also said both Russia and Belarus posed a threat to the EU. Well, I'm joined now for assessment of the last 24 hours and what we can look ahead to by Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. A very good morning to you, Nina.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us in the studio. I mean, everybody turned up and sort of pitched in with what they could do, didn't they, yesterday? It was a sense of what can you bring to the table to do two things, to bolster defence for EU as a whole, but also to continue support for Kyiv.
I think it's fair to say in the last 6 weeks, since Donald Trump returned to the White House, Europe collectively has been hit by a lightning bolt. It's suddenly woken up and realised that although the European Union has 22 members that are part of NATO, not all of them are part of NATO, and this is a region in the world where the borders dovetail with NATO's borders, and if the largest and most important member of NATO, the United States, is no longer committed to this part of the world's security, they have one heck of a big problem. Less Houston, we have a problem. More like Brussels, we have a problem, Emma. And so they've realised that they really need to shore up their defences as soon as possible. This summit was all about two things: putting money where their mouth is. The question is whether or not they have the weapon-making capability to make their own armaments as soon as possible. And then the second objective was to demonstrate a show of support for Ukraine. They were trying to get money and armaments together for Ukraine, but predictably, one of the irksome members from Eastern Europe, which is Hungary, put a spanner in the works to that. So what was actually achieved? Well, they agreed to pony up 800 billion euros worth of collective funds straight away for defence. About 150 billion of that will be coming for loans for countries that don't yet spend enough on defence and might not have enough money to do so. The idea here is to get everybody inside the EU up to speed. But as I said before, apart from the usual platitudes, unfortunately, Volodymyr Zelensky went home somewhat empty-handed if he was expecting a few tens of billions of weapons immediately from Europe.
One did look at the meeting yesterday and thought it looked like a very similar scene, and one wondered where the change occurred here. I mean, you talked about the rapid increased investment in the military and also in production of armaments. But there is that big problem, isn't there, that for so long, Emmanuel Macron, for example, has been leading the charge on having some sort of united European defence force. And everybody has resisted it. But arguably now this is the time where he possibly could feel quite vindicated.
He was right all along, wasn't he? He made that famous first of his 2 Sorbonne speeches back in 2017. That was just after Donald Trump had taken office in the White House during his first term and all the chaos surrounding that. And now we have Trump 2.0 as chaos on a logarithmic scale. And Emmanuel Macron yesterday returned to his Sorbonne speeches again, appealing for a more ambitious, united Europe, one that was able to defend itself. The difficulty throughout Emmanuel Macron's last term has been that he hasn't had the accompaniment of a strong Germany and a strong German chancellor to help him in that endeavour. But that is likely to change now, as Friedrich Merz of the CDU, now having won the election in Germany, got the most votes in the February election just last month, and he's likely to form a grand coalition with the SPD, so that's the outgoing Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So they have a reason to want to work together on some issues, and one of the key issues will be lifting this debt brake that prevents Germany from spending to stimulate its economy that's in a third year of recession, that's dealing with a surge in the far right, but also to spend on things like defence. Because the real concern Donald Trump says he has about Europe and NATO's commitment as a whole to defending Europe is that big economies like Germany haven't been spending a lot on armaments. But there's a reason for that, Germany says. It's because after the legacy of the Second World War, for many a year, they were told not to.
And one wonders, when you do have the United States clearly going in a new direction that perhaps we could have anticipated, can Europe step up and match it?
So let's look at some of the numbers here. Obviously, Europe has tried over the last couple of years to commit to making something like 1 million rounds of armaments per year. It's still way behind those types of targets. The manufacturing capability might be more present in countries like France and Germany. But if you look at spending as a percentage of GDP on defence for some of the southern European countries like Spain and Italy, it's woefully below that 2% target of GDP, despite the fact that NATO set that target a decade or so ago. And now we've got this suggestion coming from people inside the Trump administration in the last couple of days, openly acknowledging that Donald Trump might say, well, no, actually, even if we're a member of NATO, we're not going to defend members of NATO that don't spend at least 2% of GDP on defending themselves, or even more. There are members of the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, that, as I said, is now in the ascendant after this recent election, who say, hang on a second, spending more on GDP on defending ourselves and on weapons, even if Germany is able to lift this debt brake and do that, only means buying American weapons, and they could turn them off from one day to the next. So the real concern here is, how do they make the weapons, even if they've got the money, and who would they buy them from? And if they bought them from America, is that really just what Donald Trump wants, just to get everybody to panic buy US weaponry to stimulate the US economy?
We also have the issue of constricting or frameworks which to certain degrees constrict. So we mentioned NATO and the amount of money that needs to be contributed. If the West goes in a different direction, it splits. And then we have the European Union, which doesn't want in principle to have a defence force. Nonetheless, the threat from Russia remains. We saw Emmanuel Macron a couple of days ago on French television effectively saying that we must prepare for the day that the US is not there. We must prepare for the fact that Russia is not going away, and if it doesn't stop at Ukraine, it will keep going. But is there a thought or an idea perhaps that there is a third way, that there is a construction of a new idea, a new force, whatever framework it might take, which takes the bits of NATO that it needs, which takes the bits of the European Union, but can manage to sort of forge a path and perhaps include the likes of the United Kingdom?
Well, we're not quite there yet, but that's obviously what we seem to be heading towards at this point. If, of course, the United States continues to detach from NATO emotionally, financially, militarily. And Valery Zaluzhny, who's the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK, who's a former general and big war hero, he's one of those people who in Ukraine, his name has been floated as being a possible replacement for Vladimir Zelensky if indeed the Trump administration tries to continue to shove Zelensky out, which appears to be what has happened over the last couple of weeks. He was at a conference here in London focused on defence and very blatantly said Europe should be preparing for the days when NATO is no longer here. This is essentially the end of NATO. Now, we're not sure whether we've kind of reached that point or not. And as I said, whether or not the objective of Donald Trump really is a sort of financial transaction to get people to buy more weaponry from the United States. But I think this idea of having more what's called, quote unquote, sovereign autonomy, which is the idea that Emmanuel Macron floated in these two key Sorbonne speeches that he made over the last several years, is something that Europe will have to address. There'll be a lot of countries that are uncomfortable about this, though. As you were saying before, some of the sort of slightly more pacifist quarters in Germany, like the outgoing chancellor, who will still be part of their government if they have this grand coalition that's shaping up. So I think we're way off that now. But let's just have a look at how many troops Europe would actually need to defend itself and how much money it would need to defend itself. Because if you look at these figures, you get the idea that there's no way that they can find money, time and personnel, trained personnel to defend Ukraine. It's likely that they'll need 300,000 troops to defend their own borders, 250 billion euros in annual defence spending, and that's just to defend Europe. And Zelensky, in the meantime, says, well, look, if you are able to try and send your forces over the border to help defend us, which is an idea that, as you said, Keir Starmer of the UK has floated alongside Emmanuel Macron, we would need 100,000 to 150,000 troops, and France and the UK are only talking about 40,000 or so max.
In your time as covering the European Union and Europe as a whole for years, did you ever think we'd be having this conversation?
Not as quickly as we're having it. I think this is the issue. And part of the problem is, and I know you and I have discussed this before, Emma, is that nothing moves quickly inside the EU, partly because you've got 27 member states that have to usually agree on all things unanimously. And of course, there was one predictable bête noire in the room here in the form of Viktor Orban's Hungary, which is quite close to the Kremlin. There was a surprising spot, though, in this EU summit yesterday, and that was the fact that Slovakia, that often has allied itself with Hungary, actually fully supported this plan to try and, show some commitment to Ukraine and commitment to defending the EU's borders. And that was a surprising bright spot, I would say, here.
Nina Dos Santos, thank you as ever for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's 16:13 in Seoul, just nudging at 7:13 a.m. here in London. Now, no South Korean judge has ever occupied a seat on the International Court of Justice. But Seoul has now said that one of the most senior members of its judiciary will stand for election to the ICJ. Well, the court, which is part of the United Nations, is the only one to preside over disputes between countries or to give opinions on matters of international law. South Korea has until recently been held up as a model of democracy until last December, when President Yoon briefly declared martial law. So to examine what role South Korean judges could play in all this, I'm joined now by Stephen Borowick, who's a journalist and contributing writer for Nikkei Asian Review. Very good afternoon to you, Stephen. Welcome back to Monocle Radio.
Hi, nice to be here.
So who is the candidate?
His name is Baek Jin-hyun. He's a former president and judge of the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. He's a very experienced jurist. He's also served as a professor at Seoul National University, which is the most prestigious academic institution in Korea. So he's kind of on paper, he's very much a suitable candidate for a job like this, given his deep legal knowledge and his extensive international experience.
Tell us a little bit about just the benefits that a South Korean judge would bring to the ICJ, given the fact that until recently, and we'll come to what happened in December in a moment, South Korea has been held up as an absolutely beautiful model of democracy and adherence to the rule of law.
Oh, that depends on one's perspective. I mean, we could talk about the South Korean government's take on this is just to take a step back. Just generally, South Korea has for a long time been very keen on the idea of having South Korean nationals serve in positions of responsibility in major international institutions because they feel like it confers a kind of legitimacy, or it's a kind of honorable thing for the country to do. It, reflects well on this country, and they feel like as the country's international position climbs and as the country becomes a bigger economic and diplomatic player, that it ought to have footholds in these kinds of big international institutions, because I feel like that's a kind of adequate reflection of the country's growing prestige more generally. Whether or not just the appointment of this one, we have to keep in mind that he would not be there in a kind of advocacy role. He's not there, trying to pursue South Korea's national interests. So he's not, seeking material benefits in that way. But I think a lot of it is just about perception. A lot of it is about the kind of prestige and honor that comes with seeing a national of this country succeed in a major international forum like the International Court of Justice.
So we must ask, therefore, what do the events of the 3rd of December do to this? When we remember that President Yoon briefly declared martial law, and it has led to not only 2 cases, one in the Constitutional Court and a second in a criminal court of President Yoon, the first South Korean president to be impeached. And also it's split the country in 2 in terms of who supports and who does not support the president. What effect does this have on the rest of the world's perception of the way that South Korea runs itself and indeed runs its judiciary?
Well, let's just flag that Yoon is actually not the first South Korean president to be impeached. He's not even the first South Korean president in the last 10 years to be impeached. That's another thing that's kind of up for, depends on one's interpretation. I'm kind of have the impression right now that the whole affair, which has now been dragging on for a few months, I think you can argue pretty persuasively that it testifies to the soundness of South Korea's democracy, that it's instead of being a red flag, I think it's a demonstration that this country has a democracy that functions quite well. And what I mean by that is you had one leader who attempted to override the normal legal process, and he failed quite spectacularly in doing this. Yoon's attempt at instituting martial law only lasted a few hours. Lawmakers were able to gather in the legislature and vote it down, and since then we've had an almost entirely peaceful adjudication of this. It's not over yet, but the Constitutional Court is likely to rule in the next week or two as to whether Yoon will be formally impeached or whether he'll be able to return to office. And yeah, there certainly are some bitter divisions that have emerged, but these kinds of political divisions, these sharp contrasts between the right and left sides of the political spectrum, have existed for a very long time. I do think that they've, at least in some ways, sharpened, and they might be harder to untangle, but this will be a task for the next administration to try to address the very real grievances that some South Korean citizens have. The economy here is not in a great space. We've seen a rising cost of living and other kinds of social and economic issues. So in South Korea, as in countries kind of all over the world right now, there's a fair bit of anxiety, but there's no reason to believe that this country's democracy is not going to be able to function from here on out.
Sorry, I do apologise. I got my cases mixed up, Stephen. Yoon is, I think, the first sitting head of Korea to stand trial in a criminal case. The impeachment one is something else.
There's all kinds of distinctions. They're hard. Even I do this for a living, and even I can't keep them all.
I hope it's taken as an honest mistake. Finally, just look. What does this do for South Korea and indeed the region as a whole? Because we have a new ICJ president. He's a Japanese judge. So what does it say about the region in terms of the way that it now, the increasing role that it could now play in global justice?
Well, it's an increasing, we talk a lot about representation nowadays, different people representing different groups having a seat at the table and being able to not only reflect their own reflect their backgrounds and the way that they see things, and having perhaps a different approach to their job than, a judge from Japan or South Korea might approach the issue of international enforcement of international law in a way that is different than someone from Europe or North America might. And at the same time, I think it's also just a testament to the growing importance of legal traditions in other parts of the world. And there's reason to believe that these countries will continue to seek these kinds of representation because, as we've laid out before, it's a kind of endorsement of their own institutions at home and their own legal traditions at home.
Stephen Borowick, journalist and contributing writer for Nikkei Asian Review, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
We learned, possibly hearteningly, given the trajectory upon which the world in general appears determined, that bad ideas can be unhad.
Stay with us on The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
7:21 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Latika Burke, journalist and expert in geopolitics. A very good morning to you, Latika. How's it going?
Good morning, Emma.
Good to have you with us. We've just had a little snippet of what's to come in Andrew Muller's What We Learned review of the week. And he said, bad ideas can be unhad. This perhaps can be applied to the utter chaos that seems to be ensuing with Donald Trump's decision to impose tariffs. Tariffs become placed. Tariffs are placed. Tariffs kick in. Tariffs are stopped.
Yeah. So we're going to start with a Wall Street Journal article, Emma. And one of the things to note about this is top story in the Wall Street Journal, and it requires 3 bylines: Washington, Toronto and Mexico City. And what we have is a story reporting what happened overnight, which is Donald Trump partially easing some of the tariffs on goods from Mexico and Canada after, of course, those governments lobbied him to say, look, this is, in Justin Trudeau's words, a dumb idea. Now, he has given some goods a reprieve, more for Mexico than for Canada, and he seems to have a very personal dislike of Justin Trudeau, who is stepping down in a couple of days as Canada's Prime Minister. And so we think about 40% of goods will now get a reprieve, those from Canada. And in response, Canada will not introduce its reciprocal tariffs. So we are having a slight easing of a trade war. But nevertheless, those tariffs do remain on a huge proportion of goods, and we will, for the foreseeable future, according to this article, and according to Mr. Trudeau, be in a trade war. Well, Canada will be for, quote, the foreseeable future.
Do we know why he's rode back on this one? And the New York Times has talked about, its headline is, with Trump's tariff reprieve, Mexico and Canada still wary, breathe easier. And they talk about how Claudia Sheinbaum had a conversation. He was telling her, the tariffs are inescapable. Clearly, there's no warmth between Trump and Trudeau in Canada. Was it perhaps the fact that the markets were tanking at the reaction to this, and someone had probably gone into the room and said, Mr. President, if you continue to do this, you're going to bust the economy?
Well, I mean, all of that was so clear, one might say. But yes, we do know that there's 2 metrics Trump really does care about. One are his polling ratings, the second being the markets. And the markets were for some time pricing in that this was all bluff and bluster. Well, hang on, he went ahead with it. And what we are seeing is a very different Trump this second time around. It's much more, I think, deliberate. It is much more focused, and it is much more determined to do the crazy things he says, as opposed to Trump 1.0, Emma, when we saw a lot of rhetoric and a lot of whiplash. This, I think, is the first sign of that chaotic approach to governing coming back that we see from Trump. And this will cause a lot of unease on the markets, that other metric that Trump cares so deeply about, because people have been trying to anticipate how he might respond, how he might be approaching government. They thought a lot of this might be a bluff. They thought it might be his crazy, brave, insane negotiating tactic where you demand the moon and maybe you settle for, Barbados instead. And no, what we are seeing is this, again, knee-jerk whiplash, chaotic approach to government. So it's an interesting story to watch. We'll see how much of these tariffs come in and out over the course of a month. But, of course, completely a nightmare for anyone wanting to do trade between Canada and Mexico and the US.
Well, let's try and bring in another story that you wanted to draw our attention to, which is sort of connected to all this, which is a line in the Financial Times, and it's a line from Air France KLM's Ben Smith, and it's the fact that American travellers are spending themselves silly while they're abroad, which obviously suggests that there is still money out there, and there are a big enough number of Americans who believe that the economy is absolutely fine under Trump, if not, will actually thrive.
Yeah, this is really interesting, and I'm fascinated to know particularly why it's affecting Paris. Maybe they heard that Monocle had opened a bureau in Paris.
Yes, that is the reason.
I think this is...
It might have something to do with Emily in Paris, but yes, no doubt. Rue Bachemont may play
it's all Tyler.
Central figure.
It's all Tyler. Look, a great story in the Financial Times this morning. And this is an interview with the CEO, Ben Smith of Air France, so KLM. And they are talking about the bonanza that they are seeing in wealthy Americans coming over and spending big, big bucks. And we are talking not just a usual tourist influx. We are talking huge sums. They're spending them on fashion in Paris, of course, and on very luxe hotels. And some of the quotes from Ben Smith from Air France are really interesting. It's unbelievable what Americans are paying to come over here. And if you look at what it costs to stay down the street at the 5-star Bristol Hotel, the biggest suite there is $50,000 a night. And the economic options, they start at $2,000. So, I mean, these are really, really enormous sums. Now, he says there was some, quote, crazy activity coming around Paris Fashion Week. And Air France is subsequently starting to charge around $24,000 for return first class between New York and Paris. And those are beginning in April. So you're absolutely right. All this chaos that we see in the United States, whatever trepidations there are, it's clearly not cutting into yet the elite and the wealthy who are looking at America and perhaps deciding not to holiday there, coming to Paris, and not just coming to Paris, but doing it in absolutely sensational style.
We do have to thank possibly La Première from the Air France's beautiful luxury cabin to sort of boost everything, prices included and the quality. What's interesting about this story then, and the FT brings up, is that actually Air France KLM has seen net profit halved. And Ben Smith is saying, look, it's the Olympics putting people off from travelling to Paris. There's also been higher operational costs at KLM. Nonetheless, shares went up by 33% on the announcement of this. Yeah. So there's clearly faith here.
Yes, I think this is a fascinating combination of factors, as you very well point out. One of the other things that he makes a really interesting point around is that they clearly see a premium market in direct flights, not so much the stopover flights. So he's on the record here saying we can't compete directly with Turkish Airlines or those Middle Eastern carriers that hop onto Asia because their stops are in, Doha or Dubai. And he's saying unless it's a passenger who wants to fly direct, we can't really charge these premium fares and these higher yields that he forecasts boosting KLM's stocks in the next financial year. But I mean, let's see.
And there's also the issue of the fact that the kinds of travellers are changing. As this whole FT article is based on the fact that it is luxury travellers who are going. Yeah. This is luxury leisure travellers. The business world is changing. Or Ben Smith saying that it's going, this is not their most
exactly
profitable area.
Well, I mean, isn't that the Zoom effect, Emma? I mean, we all know that travel for work has changed substantially since the pandemic, and luxury travel is really the bonanza. And I guess in many ways we could be seeing a return almost to that higher end, that kind of 80s style travel where the wealthy did travel and it was not as affordable. Well, at least not in this style. Never was going to be affordable in this style, let's be honest. We're talking first-class cabins. But it is a really fascinating trend, and it's not necessarily one that people would have anticipated taking place during the pandemic. A lot of predictions were made during that time, and I'm not entirely sure that this was something everybody foresaw.
Latika Book, thank you so much, as ever, for joining us in the studio with the papers. The time here in London is just nudging 7:30 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. US and Ukrainian delegates will meet in Saudi Arabia next week. They're expected to discuss what Washington calls an initial ceasefire with Russia. President Zelensky has indicated he will attend the meeting. Donald Trump has suspended tariffs on both Canada and Mexico for a month. The 25% tariffs, which came into force on Tuesday, will now be delayed until April the 2nd. Stocks in the United States closed down 1.8% on Thursday. And the Vatican has released an audio message from the Pope. He's been in hospital in Rome for almost 3 weeks with pneumonia. The recording of his short message of thanks was played out across St. Peter's Square yesterday evening. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Just nudging 7:31 here in London. Now, Ukraine has found itself not only 3 years into a full-scale Russian invasion, it now lies at the heart of a potential split of the West, waiting to find out who will step up and support its fight against Moscow. Well, to talk about this and to have a look at some other stories which are coming out of Ukraine, I'm joined by Julia Lassica, Monocle's writer and researcher. A very good morning to you, Julia.
Good morning.
Suddenly, you found yourself quite stuck in the middle, haven't you? Just waiting not for someone to come to your rescue, but this is very much about who is going to step up and help. And Europe's security has suddenly become absolutely tied into Ukraine's security.
Yeah, it's interesting that it's like for Europeans and I guess for Americans as well, it's this watershed moment, whereas for Ukrainians, we've been seeing it like this for a long time. We've been saying to Europeans, trying to plead with you, this is absolutely fundamental to your security. What happens with us is what happens with you later down the line. And I mean, not even, but I guess there's the hybrid threats as well. There's sort of empowering Russia and allowing them to grow their ambitions. So yes, I think it's this moment where narratives are crystallised and people are sort of starting to see what we've been seeing for a while as well.
And we're now seeing next week, on Tuesday, I believe, a meeting between the Ukrainians and the United States in Saudi Arabia. This again is that, is there a sense that after the debacle of Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office last week, one wonders what the tone will be like on Tuesday and whether Zelensky will have to do a little bit of begging?
Yeah, maybe, and he'll maybe have to say thank you quite a few more times as well, and maybe I don't know, wear something different. I don't know what sort of tact he'll take, but it might be very different to what we'll see. Maybe it won't, and then we won't have this sort of agreement that we're hoping, that people are hoping for. I think for Ukrainians, it's a scary moment because it's in history. There are these moments where things are decided over your head, and you don't quite believe that it will happen to you as well. But it is this feeling that no one really knows what's on the table. No one knows what the US is actually demanding. So many things are being thrown around. And I saw one piece of advice yesterday from a blogger, which was, don't read the news too much. Everything will be decided and you'll find out what happens. But just don't read all these kind of insider reports. They will just stress you out and it will just impact your life, and just focus on surviving, focus on getting through every day.
Did Ukraine ever think that it was going to be at the centre of a split of the West?
Well, again, there are these historians who've been talking about Ukraine, and not just Ukrainians, but Western historian Timothy Snyder from Yale, who've been saying Ukraine is central to Western civilization and future. If we look at the Second World War and if we look at the course of the 20th century, the breakup of the Soviet Union, Ukraine does find itself at these horribly pivotal moments in Western civilization.
Let's look at the way that other countries are stepping up. I think you wanted to bring in the story involving France. Now that the United States has stopped sharing intelligence with Ukraine, which will have consequences, France has said that it will step up instead.
Yeah, what I found really interesting about this story was what the defence minister said when he was sort of talking about this, which is that, for example, the Brits are in a complicated situation because potentially it seems that Washington has told them also to stop sharing intelligence with Ukraine, which is difficult because obviously London is very, very much aimed at shoring up support for Ukraine, and that affects the other Five Eyes members, which Britain and the US are part of. So perhaps Australia, Canada and New Zealand are also being prevented from sharing their intelligence. So it's interesting. And it's also, again, showing, as with the nuclear umbrella, France is autonomous, France is independent.
Let's move on to some other stories as well in terms of the amount of other countries stepping up. Norway has decided that it is now going to help Ukraine as well. It's astonishing to see how other countries are sort of looking at what they've got to give.
Definitely, yeah. So Norway was actually criticised a month ago, at the end of January, because it came out that they'd earned 107 billion extra euros in additional revenue because of higher gas prices, because of, their position in the gas market. So now they have announced an extra 4.3 billion euros for this year, for 2025, for Ukraine. And it means their total contribution until 2030 rises to 17.5 billion euros. But yeah, as you said, we're looking around Europe and we're seeing how finally the continent is stepping up. The Europeans yesterday announced a much bigger defence package, spurred on by von der Leyen. In Netherlands, for example, they've allocated 700 million euros for drone production and so on.
And we now have China sort of weighing in as well, which up until now has been rather neutral. It has decided to keep itself to one side when it comes to all this, nonetheless retaining quite close ties with Russia in certain areas. It now has said that it is appalled at what Trump is doing.
Yeah, I love this comment from the Chinese special envoy for European affairs. Said that they're appalled, and I think that also what that points at is this interesting relationship actually between Europe and China, of course, and Ukraine and China. Ukraine and China have been bound up for many years now. Lots and lots of cooperation. Ukrainians, for example, have made a huge contribution to their navy, modernizing the Chinese navy. So it is really interesting how China is playing this game, and of course with tariffs coming in, are we going to see something different going on with trade?
Finally, let's look at a story which is not related to Ukraine being at the mercy of the rest of the world's decisions. This is about metro signs in Kyiv.
Yes, this is my favourite story ever. So when I was growing up and going, around the metro in Kyiv, it's very Soviet. Picture any sort of Soviet statues or Soviet art, and it's monumental and it's huge. Whereas this typographer, Bogdan Hdal, he's gone back into the sort of roots of Ukrainian identity and culture, which is back to the Cossack times and then back into the 10th, 11th century to the Kievan Rus. And he's brought out these gorgeous iterations of Ukrainian Cyrillic alphabet characters, and he's redesigning the signs on the metro, so the names of the metro stations, and that kind of everything goes around that as well, the mosaics that you have, the visuals. It's gorgeous.
And how much this is clearly a political decision, isn't it, is to try and erase Moscow's narratives from the walls of Kyiv?
I wouldn't say so much erase, but just bring out Ukrainian narratives. Ukraine is its own country, it's an independent country, and every country deserves its own typography, every country deserves its own visual culture, and identity. So, bringing that out, and Russia can have its own space in Moscow and St. Petersburg, wherever they want. But in Ukraine and Kyiv, we want to have sort of this gorgeous Ukrainian iteration of visual culture.
When you say it's a gorgeous iteration, and obviously the way that a city's metro system can actually be representative of the city itself, because it has to incorporate every area and every design. So when this new design comes out, what will it look like and how will it convey Ukraine?
Yes, it's these really thin scripts, thin characters. So I guess I'm actually reading Lord of the Rings at the moment. It's these runes. It's almost like that's, been etched in with these sort of ink and very thin, slender lines. It's really beautiful, and this light golden colour as well.
Julia Lassica, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. You're listening to Monocle Radio. A look now at another story we're keeping an eye on today. Anita Riotta now examines the tightrope the Italian Prime Minister is walking between the US and Europe.
Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's ambition to become a bridge between Europe and the US is looking shaky. Despite being the only EU head of state invited to Trump's inauguration, her favor is unlikely to survive any critique of the president, even if she does disagree with the White House cozying up to Vladimir Putin. As her British and French counterparts, Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron have taken a leading role in trying to organize Europe's defense, Meloni's competing allegiances are making things uncomfortable in the domestic arena. Her deputy prime minister, Matteo Salvini, has positioned himself as the Italian White House mouthpiece by criticizing EU proposals to defend Ukraine. It's a ploy that has irked Meloni, who publicly rebuked Salvini in Parliament this week with the phrase, "Basta con I giochini," enough of your little games. While among her fellow European leaders, her influence is waning. Despite criticizing Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron's proposal to send troops to Ukraine, she has failed to propose a viable alternative. Over the past week, Meloni has increasingly relied on meaningless platitudes when the moment demands both words and actions with more substance. A divided West is fatal, she announced. If she intends to make Italy great again, she'll need a plan that the country and continent can get behind.
Anita Riotta there. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, the Monocle Minute. You just go to monocle.com/minute. Now, Spain's biggest art fair, Arco Madrid, is in full swing in the country's capital. It brought together old Europe, Latin America and the rest of the globe through the hosting of booths from 179 galleries, a rich programme of events and curatorial presentations. Amid the hustle and bustle of the fair, Monocle's Robert Bound caught up with director Maribel Lopez. He began by asking her how the fair attracts international collectors.
Well, I think Arco Madrid, it's an old fair, 44 years, and also somehow an institution. And I think one of the things we do is we push the galleries. We try to help them to present things that are not so well known, that when collectors come, they know they're going to discover something, they're going to have space and time to look at artworks. So we try to offer something different, another kind of experience, and also, we are very welcoming people, and we try the fair to also have that spirit, no? And all that is working, I would say.
And how do you do that? Because we came here last year, we had a great time, you were such a wonderful interview, and you gave us a very warm welcome. How do you do that? Because there is obviously there is a big mix of the curatorial and the commercial, like any art fair. How do you do that at Arco Madrid? Because it does feel like you are embraced into a warm bosom here, Maribel, by the city, but by the fair itself. And we are, let's face it, we are not necessarily in beautiful surroundings here. We're in a huge hangar, but it does feel like it's got a very good atmosphere. So how do you ensure or encourage that to happen?
There are many layers to that. First, of course, the galleries. We encourage the galleries to take challenges. We also put some rules, so galleries that are under 40 square meters cannot present more than 4 artists. This is one of the rules. Then we offer them spaces for the presentation of more challenging commercial projects by a really symbolic price. We do that. Then we make also a better price when they take another kind of challenge, just presenting to artists. So first, by helping the galleries to take that next step, in terms of challenge, and that makes another kind of a space. But then also with the architecture, we put a lot of effort in the architecture of the common areas, because as you said, this is a hangar. Is the total of the fair is 38,000 square meters, which is a lot of walking, a lot of grey, the floor and the ceiling. So we collaborate with young architects to develop what we call the common areas, the forum and the restaurants, etc., the guest lounge. But this is normally a VIP lounge at other fairs. It's a guest lounge for us.
We'll see you there.
Yeah. And that is done by Mesura. That is a very interesting architect office in Barcelona. And also the special subject of the year is also done by another team of architects. So what we try is that the art experience is very focused, is very frontal, but then somehow the social experience also connects with the way we are in this city, no? We like to be with friends, we go to bars, so we have to reproduce that somehow. If not, everybody will go to town. But then it's true that also the institutions in Madrid are very close to the fair. They all understand the fair as part of their ecosystem, so we connect deeply. And there are performance tomorrow in Reina Sofia with one of the artists from Amazonas, also in Casa Encendida, exhibitions by collectors. So yeah, the whole city also embraces.
And you've obviously each year you kind of slightly shuffle your deck of cards with the galleries that are showing here. You've got some new entries this year. At what point down the line, sort of in terms of last year, the year before, are you and your committee choosing galleries, thinking about kind of, as I say, shuffling the pack and getting some new names on some of those booths?
It's really complicated. I think this is one of the hardest.
That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, I know. That's so. This fair, if we talk about this fair in this way, you say you are warm, you are welcome. That's really important for us. So the galleries that have been participating in this fair for 30 years are part of Arco, but every year they have to prove they deserve to be at Arco. And when the fair goes better and better, other galleries who were visiting, because we know all the galleries who are visiting this year, so we are hoping for a very complicated committee next year. So all these galleries who were visiting apply this year. We have 9 galleries that were never at the fair, and I think 25 new entries in total. These new entries are people who didn't come for a few years. COVID, of course, shook things a bit. So this year was very, very difficult because these new galleries, no committee can say no to them. And we have to take care of our scene because Arco cannot forget that it's a Spanish international art fair. So the solution for that was increase the fair in 9 galleries, which is not much, but it is. And that was to protect a bit also those people who are so faithful that were a bit in challenge, no? People who does not do so many art fairs, is not visible internationally, but it's also the flavor of this fair. And then something else we do is invite curators, so they bring us new galleries, new ideas, etc. That's very important to kind of shuffle these cards.
And that was Arco Madrid's Maribel Lopez talking to Monocle's Robert Bound at Arco Madrid. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
It's Friday, so let's find out what we learned from Andrew Muller.
We learned this week of a partial success in the field of artificial speciation.
What? Really? What? I don't understand. What's the deal with that?
Artificial speciation, the science of creating new species via human intervention. It is a common expression round our way.
I get it now.
Righto, carry on.
We learned that boffins, who had set themselves the task of reconstituting the woolly mammoth, sure, why not, had fallen arguably somewhat short and come up instead with a woolly mouse. We learned that the white-coated Poindexters of frankly misleadingly named outfit Colossal Biosciences were trying to style this out as a work in progress, claiming that the admittedly luxuriantly fluffy rodents had mammoth-like traits, which is somewhat like arguing that one's garden shed has Sydney Opera House-like traits. Sure, they're both buildings with doors and a roof, etc., but come on. We learned, nevertheless, that the bespectacled weirdos responsible, in their short-sleeved shirts all buttoned all the way up to the top and biros in the breast pockets, are insisting as of this broadcast that they will turn loose the first full-grown artificial woolly mammoth not later than 2028. Doesn't matter, lads. Girls still won't talk to you. Anyway, sticking with the subject of friendless oddballs labouring to make a case for a lumbering pachyderm with unruly ginger blonde hair, we learned what a profile in courage really is. We learned this from US Vice President J.D. Vance shortly after his Oval Office berating of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who is, of course, a simpering, effete milquetoast who has never passed any test sterner than staying at his post and leading his nation's resistance at the moment of invasion by one of Earth's biggest militaries, advanced elements of which were under specific instruction to kill him personally. Honestly, who does he think he is?
Mr. President, with respect, I think it's disrespectful for you to come into the Oval Office and try to litigate this in front of the American media. Right now, you guys are going around and forcing conscripts to the front lines because you have manpower problems. You should be thanking the president for trying to bring an end to this conflict.
Have you ever been to Ukraine that you say what problems we have?
I have been to...
Count one.
I've actually watched and seen the stories.
For we learned that Vice President Vance's heroics did not stop at having watched the news from time to time. We learned that on a subsequent ski outing to Vermont, where his motorcade was greeted by no less terrifying a menace than a few hundred shivering citizens swaddled in parkas and brandishing somewhat uncomplimentary placards, he bravely, and with no thought at all for his own safety...
The New York Post is reporting that Vice President J.D. Vance was forced to move his family to an undisclosed location after pro-Ukrainian protesters swarmed the ski resort where he was vacationing.
Humbling, it truly is. But all leaden sarcasm aside, we did learn that there is one group of people to whom Vance genuinely is willing to stand up and tell it like it is, i.e. the safely dead soldiers of the Allies who have fought in America's wars these last few decades.
The very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years.
Been about that long since America won one, mind you. Maestro, the national anthem of Lesotho. For we learned that there is at least one country which does not, as of this broadcast, figure in the fevered dreams of conquest indulged by Vice President Vance's immediate superior, and we learned this from the interminable oration before Congress of US President Donald Trump, during which he listed some of the outgoings he claims to have clipped from the foreign aid budget.
$8 million to promote LGBTQI+. In the African nation of Lesotho, which nobody has ever heard of.
Listeners may not be entirely shocked to learn that efforts since by inquiring media are yet to locate one LGBTQI+ citizen of Lesotho who possesses the least idea what Trump was talking about. However, avid listeners to Monocle Radio's The Foreign Desk, like there are any other kind, etc., will have heard of Lesotho because we had the king on once.
I can't speak for other monarchies, but speaking for myself, I do tend to use the opportunity, and whenever I meet other heads of state or even heads of government, to, if I can put it that way, put Lesotho on the map.
Yes, we're showing off. Live with it. The Foreign Desk, every Saturday at midday. Do tune in.
Come on. Just get on with it.
And... we learned, possibly hearteningly given the trajectory upon which the world in general appears determined, that bad ideas can be unhad. We learned that UK-based financial services concern Aberdeen had decided to reinsert the E's into their name, which had been Aberdeen, as in the handsome Scottish city, until 2021, when some marketing genius who may not have been one of Aberdeen's wiser investments suggested that they, if you will, disembowel themselves, resulting in a name which absolutely nobody could pronounce.
Aberdeen.
See? We learned that Aberdeen have now thought better of this and will once again be Aberdeen.
And my thanks to Andrew Muller for that. You'll hear another instalment at the same time next week, right here on The Globalist. Finally, on today's programme, a quick look about what we can expect from Milan's Triennale, which opens in May. The event was originally intended as a showcase for North Italy's industrial base. Now it's a forum where the design world does its best to influence policy. Tim Abrams is contributing editor to the Architectural Record. He's in Milan and he joins me now. Good morning, Tim. How's Milan looking?
It's looking beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, very sunny, although I believe everywhere is sunny today. I can't quite imagine that, but here we are. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And very excited to find out about what happened at the launch of the Triennale yesterday.
The Triennale is a very interesting event, as you've alluded to. It's effectively a part of the Expo scheme, the Expo World Global Organization, in which different events based on the Great Exhibition in the 1850s show off industrial wares. Now, in Milan, that was supplanted by the Salone in 1961. And since then, the Triennale has kind of been something of an irregular event in which they were looking for a purpose. And it's only really under the auspices of Stefano Boeri, who took the role of president in 2018, that the event has found a niche for itself. And that's really to discuss the relevance and use for design, how it relates to society and political agency. So this was really a sense, the organisation of the press conference was really a sense of how design can be useful. And the exemplary project, which will be included in this Triennale, was by Theaster Gates, the Chicago-based artist and architect, and he is looking at the role of art in the resurgence of a city in Japan, in Tokonami, in which the industry was clay pipe making. It was supplanted by plastics, and instead the artists came in, and ceramic became a global center for ceramics. So this is seen as a way in which art, design, architecture can actually reveal latent potentials, I think. And I think the latency, the possibilities is something that this Triennale is really aiming to reveal.
Is there still a big sense, or a sense at all, that design is not necessarily an important enough influence in social policy, that those who make decisions about the way that our cities are built and our countries are run don't necessarily see design as a problem-solving tool?
Exactly. I think one of the issues is that design is seen as something supplementary, and I think this is actually a kind of victim of. In this case, this is a victim of its own success. The Salone is in Milan terms. This is set in Milan, so let's look at that. It's a very important, extravagant, popular event in which there's a great wow factor. You see the latest designs, the latest products, and a sense of an industry really kind of delivering the needs for nice things. And actually what Boeri is trying to do is to say that's all well and good, nice things are nice. He's a champion of some of the greatest architects and designers in his role as the president of the Triennale, but also these people need to be put together. There's actually a separation between these worlds. And what is interesting about his role, because Formerly, he was a councillor for art and culture in Milan. He had a political role from 2010 to 2013. He's actually trying to create this space where these groups can get together. He knows the political world. He is familiar with it, I think his view would be that there's not so much that these groups don't think along the same lines, but the fact is there isn't the space really for them to actually coordinate or have a conversation in which they can come up with and agreed on solutions.
Tim Abrahams, thank you so much for joining us on the line from sunny Milan. That's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all our guests and to the producers, Anita Riotta, Carlotta Rebello and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Francesca Jilks and our studio manager was Elliot Greenfield, with editing assistance from Mariella Bevan. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. Hope you can join me for that if you can. And The Globalist is back at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great weekend.